Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest. His name is Jefferson Morley, and we've spoke twice in the past about two of his interesting books. I really wanted to follow up with another book that I saw he written, which we're going to talk about today. But our earlier conversations, the first one took place in September 2019. We talked about a book titled The Ghost, The Secret Life of CIA Spy Master James Jesus Angleton. And then November 2020, we spoke about another of his books titled Morley v. CIA, My Unfinished JFK Investigation. So you can go back and listen to those two interviews if you have time on William Ramsey. But today we're going to talk about a book he published in 2014. The title of that book is Our Man in Mexico, Winston Scott and the Hidden History of the CIA. And Jefferson has also written another book titled Snowstorm in August, Washington City, Francis Scott Key, and the Forgotten Race Riot of 1835. That was published in 2012. He also has an upcoming book in June titled Scorpion's Dance. He is the editor of jfkfacts.org, so jfkfacts.org, about the JFK assassination. And you can learn more about his books at his website, which is his full name, jeffersonmorley.com, or jeffersonmorleybooks.com, and you can find him on Twitter at Jefferson Morley. Jefferson Morley, his full name. So, Jefferson Morley, welcome back to the show. Thanks for agreeing to the interview.
Thanks for having me, William.
Awesome. So, for people who may not have heard our earlier two interviews, can you maybe just kind of talk about the arc of the books you've written and this book in particular? What led you to write Our Man in Mexico?
So this book, Our Man in Mexico, is the first of a trilogy of spies, three biographies of senior CIA officers. These men were all friends, and this was the first book in the series. Winston Scott was the chief of the CIA station in Mexico City from 1956 to 1969. He was a veritable proconsul in that country, maybe the second most important man, second most powerful man in the country behind the president of Mexico. The Ghost, which we talked about in one of our earlier conversations, is the biography of James Angleton, who was the counterintelligence chief of the CIA, and he was the spy as intellectual. Win Scott was the spy as proconsul. Angleton was the spy as intellectual. And the third book in the series, Scorpion's Dance, which comes out later this year, is the story of Richard Helms, who was the director of the CIA and who really exemplifies the spy as bureaucrat. So three men, three friends in life, rose in the CIA to very different positions of power in the first 25 years of the agency. And my books explore the milieu in which these men wielded extraordinary power in different ways. So that's how I came to this. This book launched the series. I didn't have that in mind when it happened. A friend of mine, a lawyer, Mark Zaid, came to me and said, Jeff, I got a client who's got a great story. Maybe you'd like to write about it. And so he introduced me to Michael Scott, who was the son of Winston Scott. Winston Scott had died in 1971. His son, Michael, was about my age, in his early 60s now, was looking to find out more about his father. He had not known that his father was in the CIA until the day of his funeral, when his mother told him. And so in midlife, Michael made it a point to learn more about his father. He was only 16 when his father died, so he wanted to get to know him better. And he started interviewing his friends and colleagues. And eventually he sued the CIA for a manuscript that his father had written, a memoir that his father had written before he died, which had been seized by the CIA. And so Mark Zaid, the lawyer, came to me and said, get Michael to tell you his story. And so it was an extraordinary story, both as a human interest story, a son looking for his lost father, but also as an example of a powerful CIA official. And because Michael was in the family, it really created this extraordinary access to his life, his papers, his photographs, and very unusual for a top CIA official. So as a reporter, I was very intrigued. I wrote a story for the style section of the Washington Post, where I worked at the time, about Win Scott. But I always, as soon as I wrote the story, I thought, this guy is a book, And so this book, that story eventually became this book, and grew into this book, which was published by the University Press of Kansas. And so the book, because of the access that Michael gave me to his father and his friends, is really a kind of an unprecedented study of a CIA station chief. Now there are other examples of memoirs of CIA station chiefs who have written memoirs. John Richardson was in the Congo, and other books like that have been written, but they've been written by the source itself, and so they are necessarily not prejudiced, but they represent a certain point of view. Whereas I came into this as a more detached observer, and so the book is revelatory because it has very close access to the subject, but it's also sympathetic. I mean, I'm not uncritical, but I always try to understand where Win Scott was coming from. And Michael put no conditions on my writing of the story, and so I could describe him however I saw fit, and I do in the book. And while I'm quite critical of him in some ways, I always try and preserve the point of view of, what did this look like through his eyes? And so even if you don't agree with my criticism of it, it's still an extraordinary look at how a very powerful CIA station chief wielded power, and in some great, historical moments. Win Scott was very involved in the events leading up to the Kennedy assassination and the events afterwards. That's why his memoir, his manuscript, was later seized by the agency. Played a leading role in the massacre of the students on the eve of the 1968 Olympics, one of the great key decisive events in modern Mexican history. So Win Scott was very involved in that. So he's really an important figure in U.S.-Mexican relations by any stretch of the imagination, who served in revolutionary times. Mexico City in the 1960s was a really extraordinary place. It was kind of like a Casablanca. It was the only place in the Western Hemisphere where communist intelligence services could act with relative impunity or operate with relative impunity. So you had the security services of the CIA and the FBI in Mexico City. You had the Mexican security services, the DFS primarily, their version of the FBI. You had the Cuban intelligence service, and you had the Soviet KGB, all operating within a few blocks of each other, in the heart of Mexico City. So a very rich environment for seeing how the Cold War played out in a key ally of the United States. So that's the Win Scott story. And Win Scott was a very attractive man. He's not. Some spies are very shut down and opaque and hard to read, and Win Scott was a big charismatic man, interesting personal life, was married 3 times, fancied himself a bit of a poet. So he was a very interesting man to write about as well, because he was an interesting personality, very outgoing, forceful, charismatic man.
But different than Angleton and Helms in that he didn't have that kind of Ivy League pedigree, right?
No, not at all. Somebody said about the CIA, the early days of the CIA, it was scions of the Ivy League and men who were one generation from the plow. And that's exactly right. Jim Angleton and Richard Helms were scions of the Ivy League, and Win Scott was one generation from the plow. His father was a railroad engineer, maintained railroad tracks, and Win Scott actually grew up in a converted boxcar. That's how humble his origins were, in rural Alabama. He was extremely smart. He became a school teacher, went to the University of Alabama, became a school teacher, a math teacher, and then got a PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan, which led him to become an FBI agent. He ran afoul of J. Edgar Hoover in his early being stationed in Havana during the war, and he quit the FBI and was picked up by the Office of Strategic Services, and which then became the CIA. And so he was launched into a CIA career very early on with the founding of the CIA. In fact, Winston Scott was the first CIA station chief in London. When the CIA came into creation in 1947, Win Scott had made a lot of friends in the British service during the war, and he was put into that position as the chief of the London station with the formation of the CIA. Then he came back to CIA headquarters and held a variety of positions at CIA headquarters in Washington. But because he came from that humble background, he didn't have that Ivy League polish. I think he recognized early on he was not going to rise to the top of the agency. That was just that Ivy League elite really had a lock on it. There's no way at the end of the day he would get a job over some of them. And so in 1956, he went to Allen Dulles and he said, I want to leave. I don't want to work at headquarters anymore. I want to go back out into the field. And Dulles said, fine, you can have any station in the world you want. That's how highly they thought of him. And Win Scott said, I want Mexico. And so he went to Mexico and he built that station into a position of great importance. And that was how he really rose to an extraordinary position in Mexico. And that started in 1956.
Right, and you call him a proconsul, like he had close relationships with three presidents in a row there. So he was almost kind of like a puppet master or controller to a certain extent, right?
Well, he was a power behind the throne. I mean, these Mexican presidents were strong men, and they did what they wanted to do, and they had a big political environment to operate in. Their problem is in Mexican politics, domestic politics. A stance antagonistic to the United States is almost necessary because of Mexican nationalism. And so these presidents had to appeal to Mexican nationalism. They couldn't be too overtly on the side of the United States. At the same time, Win Scott gave them a chance to have good relations with the United States behind the scenes. And so he played that kind of card masterfully. So Adolfo Lopez Mateos was the president from 1958 to 1964. Gustavo Diaz Ordaz was president from 1964 to 1970, and then Luis Echeverria became president. And all three men were on the CIA payroll. That's one of the things I show in the book. And Win Scott had warm personal relationships with all three men too. So extraordinary access at the top of the Mexican government. He created, over the course of his tenure as the station chief, he created a spy network called Lee Tempo. The phrase comes from all Mexican operations were identified by a two-letter code, and it was LI. And then LI would be followed by a random noun. So Lee Tempo was the name of this spy network that Win Scott created. And he had not just the presidents, but he had about 15 top government officials on his payroll or working with him, including the heads of the security services. So really extraordinary penetration of the Mexican power structure, which gave the United States these great eyes and ears into the Mexican government, an important country, and traditionally hostile to the United States. So that was a great coup on his part, and as a result, he got to stay there. In the CIA, typically, when a station chief, you send out a guy to run operations in a country, and that the CIA base is called a station. You are typically there for 3 years, maybe 4 years, and then they move you out, to bring in fresh blood. Winston Scott was allowed to stay in Mexico City for 13 years. And the reason was he was just so good. And when people came and said, well, maybe we should get Win Scott out of there. This was in the mid 60s. And there was a big fight at the CIA and people really wanted him out. They wanted somebody new there. The ambassador mainly, because he was more important. He was more powerful than the ambassador in Mexico. So the ambassadors were trying to get rid of him or, get him sent to another position. And it went up to LBJ in the White House. And LBJ, they said, well, what do you want, Mr. President? And LBJ said, whatever Win Scott wants to do is what we're going to do. And Win Scott wanted to stay, so he stayed. it's very rare in the CIA that any station chief has been in a job for 13 years. I think there was one other in the whole history of the CIA where somebody had a station chief job for that long. So that was a testimony to his effectiveness in the Mexican political environment.
And there was a lot happening there. There was so many, there's left-wing movements. There are things happening in Central America. Can you talk about the environment and the kind of political happenings?
Well, so, one important thing to understand, and this is part of why he was an extraordinary operator, was, Mexico is a unique country. It's not like the United States, and it's not like any other country in Latin America. It's just unique. And it had a unique political system at that time. It was a one-party state, the Party of Institutional Revolution, the PRI. And so no other parties were allowed, but only in the sense like there's parties in Putin's Russia. They're mainly there for show. They're not there to wield power. So within this one party, there were powerful tendencies, different factions ranging from left to right. In the 1960s, the left-wing faction was pretty strong. The Cuban Revolution had taken place. Fidel Castro was popular in Cuba. This was, Mexico was founded in a revolution too, the revolution of 1910. And so with pretensions of, representing the people, not the rich. And so Cuba was quite popular, and these Mexican presidents had to balance these factions as well as keep tabs on them. And so one thing that Winston Scott did for these Mexican presidents was he would wiretap all their political enemies so that they could keep up with, their rivals who were angling for power. And that was a service that's how he won their loyalty. He empowered them. He gave them access to U.S. espionage technology. And so that was one reason why he was so effective. On the other hand, the Mexicans wanted to, because they were sympathetic to Cuba and non-aligned in their foreign policy, they allowed the Soviet Union to operate in Mexico. They allowed the Cuban government to operate, and those governments inevitably used their embassies, as we do, use the embassies as front for their espionage work. So at the same time that the Mexicans were very close to the CIA, they were also cultivating relations with the Russians and the Cubans. So the Mexicans were trying to kind of play both sides of the street. That was good for them in domestic politics as well. What the Cubans were doing was they were using Mexico as kind of a transit point for supporting revolutionary movements in the rest of Latin America. And they kind of had a deal with the Mexicans. And the deal with the Mexicans was the Mexicans said to the Cubans, okay, you can engage in your intelligence activities, but there's one thing you can't do. And that is you cannot support any leftist movement, guerrilla movements in Mexico, of which there were some in the poor areas. There were leftists who were trying to imitate Castro and fight the government. And so the Cubans agreed to do that. They weren't going to support any domestic leftists inside Mexico, but they were free to, make their arrangements with, revolutionary forces in other Latin American countries, and especially Central America because it was so close. So very complex spy games are going on this whole time. The head of the DFS, Gutierrez Barrios, was a very powerful figure in the Mexican political universe. He was comparable to a J. Edgar Hoover in our system, a chief law enforcement officer. The DFS was the most professional of the Mexican police forces, which were traditionally very corrupt. Gutierrez Barrios was a good, effective administrator, and he created a really professional force, which was very much appreciated by the CIA. They liked working with the DFS. But Gutierrez Barrios was very close with the Castro brothers, as well as being friends with Winston Scott. So these guys were adept at playing both sides of the game, both sides of the street in Mexico. And these things they could turn very deadly when the Mexican government wanted to, for example, the Mexican government wanted to make sure that there was not a bit of distress connected with President Kennedy's visit to Mexico in June of 1962. And so they rounded up like, 10,000 people and just put them all in jail, all the leftists they could find, so that there'd be nobody on the streets demonstrating against Kennedy. And Win Scott would help them do kind of, assist with the repressive apparatus in that way. So a very tough, real job, involving violence and coercion and that sort of thing. It's not just spy games. There was a big element of repression and impunity involved as well. So that's kind of the story of Mexico in the 60s. Their system has since changed, but at the time, that one-party system was unique and a very unusual place for an American to operate. So Win Scott's success was extraordinary.
Right, but there was so much happening. So you had Arbenz in '54, Guatemala. You had Castro,
yeah,
59, 60. So you had a lot of destabilization, and some of those characters that were surrounding Winston Scott are very important. Phillips, Hunt. Can you talk about some of the other kind of characters that are in that environment there?
Yeah, well, because this was Mexico was the one place where these various espionage services were going head to head. The CIA put a lot of resources into that station, and the Mexico City station was considered the best in the world. Win Scott was very aggressive, and so this attracted some of the top officers in the agency, and especially in the Western Hemisphere. So you mentioned Howard Hunt, most famous as the Watergate burglar. It was Howard Hunt who went to Mexico and opened the station in 1950. So he was kind of Win Scott's predecessor. He then went on to work on the Guatemala operation in 1954, in which the agency fomented a coup against the elected government there and replaced it with a military dictatorship, something that was considered a great success within the CIA at the time. And so Hunt and other officers associated with it rose in the ranks. Another one of those was David Phillips, officer involved in the 1954 coup, involved in Cuba operations with the rise of Castro. And David Phillips comes to be the chief of Cuba operations in 1962 in the Mexico City station. So he becomes friends with Win Scott and friends and colleagues. Phillips is a leading figure in the CIA for the rest of his career in the Western Hemisphere. Eventually becomes chief of the Western Hemisphere division. So another person who passes through the station there is Philip Agee, who is a young CIA officer who falls in love with a Mexican woman, and his politics go from being pretty conservative to being very leftist, and he becomes the first kind of renegade within the CIA to a few years later publishes a book and exposes CIA operations in Latin America in a big way.
Then flees to Cuba, right? So it's like the inversion of everything.
Yeah. So he publishes this book. He's living in Paris, but he's under very intense scrutiny in the mid 70s from the CIA, and I think he's worried about getting killed. And so he goes to Cuba which was his ideological preference anyway, but I think he also did it for a measure of safety. So, so a very big station, probably 50 people worked there. Very complex surveillance operations going on in multiple dimensions. So he's got the Cuban and Soviet embassies. He's got cameras outside taking pictures of everybody who come and goes. He's got the telephones inside these embassies wiretapped. He's got human sources reporting from inside. They've recruited people to give them information. At one point, they even they bought a townhouse behind the Russian embassy, and so they could look in and see when the Russians would have a cocktail party or a diplomatic reception, and they had these big glass windows, and the CIA would across the street, and they were trying to see if they could hire lip readers to decode what the people were saying in the diplomatic reception. So every little possible way of gaining some advantage intelligence-wise, Win Scott was always seeking to exploit it. He was a very aggressive, creative spy.
Right. So he had a great career all the way up to his death. But it's interesting. I've interviewed other people, and we talked about this in the pre-show, whose parents were in this kind of spy game or spy world,
Yeah.
and they have different lives. The children don't know that much about their parents or a lot of the stories around them. And some of the spy masters, they have a very complex love life too. Like some of these CIA agents, they bounced around. I mean,
Yeah.
Winston,
Well, it's and Win Scott wrote about this very perceptively in the memoir. So, eventually Michael Scott, the son, in his search for his father, he eventually gets this memoir, and in it, in the last chapter, Scott writes, I think very movingly, very poignantly, about the psychological difficulty of the life of a spy, which is basically the difficulty of living a lie, right? And so you have to always be presenting a false image to the world. And what Scott wrote in this book is what happens. He said, this is the peril of the spy, is that you're so adept at giving a false image to the world that you actually don't know yourself. And he talked about this sense of alienation that he had at the end of his life. And he wondered, was it all worth it? And he writes, he was so glad to retire and he could have a normal life with his family, and just that regaining of reality and leaving the life of deception, but the psychic toll of the life of deception. And that he was talking about himself. And then, the kids, I mean, Michael, like I said before, his mother told him at his father's funeral, he said, your father was in the CIA. He wasn't in the State Department like we always told. And Michael said that, that was news to him, although he wasn't surprised because he'd been to his father's office, which is in the embassy. But when he went to the office, to get to his father's office, you had to go through one of those doors, like a bank vault door, like a 2-foot thick steel door. And he always thought, this is like something special in the State Department. Even as a kid, he had an intuition that there was something else going on. But he didn't really know it until his father was dead. And the book, I mean, I tell the story of his father in the book, but I also tell the story of his search for his father, which was important. His father was not inaccessible to him. He was a good father. I think that's pretty unusual in the CIA of that day. Very communicative with his kids, not about his work, but just in terms of being a presence in their lives. He made time to take care of his kids and get to know them. That was one of the interesting things about him. But the life of living two lives, it can be very difficult, and Win Scott knew that as well as anybody.
right. And there was suspicious stuff in the book too about that he confirmed that Oswald was in Mexico City for 2 things.
Yeah, no, and really one of the key passages, one of the most important stories in the book, is the story of that memoir that Scott had written it and was planning to publish it. His bosses at the CIA, including Richard Helms, and Jim Angleton, were quite disturbed by that. They couldn't, because he was, these men were equals. They had come up together. Nobody was going to come and tell Win Scott what to do. Not even, powerful colleagues like Dick Helms and Jim Angleton. Win Scott he had a mind of his own. He was going to do what he wanted to do. And so the idea that he wanted to publish this book, they wanted to talk him out of it, really. And he died before anything happened, and they seized the manuscript. But in the manuscript, why did they seize the manuscript? They seized the manuscript because it had a chapter on Oswald. And the chapter on Oswald was pretty devastating to the Warren Commission. I mean, first of all, it pointed out that the Warren Commission said something about the surveillance of Oswald in Mexico City that was not true. Let me just back up a second and just explain the back of the story. Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who was accused of shooting President Kennedy on November 22nd, visited Mexico City 7 weeks before that, in early October 1963, and went to the Cuban consulate and the Soviet embassy in an effort to get a visa. He wanted to travel to Cuba and then to the Soviet Union, where he had lived a couple of years before. And he was not able to get the visa to Cuba or to the Soviet Union. And so the purpose of his trip to Mexico City was thwarted. He returned to Texas and then was later arrested for shooting the president. So the question of what was Oswald doing in Mexico City was a very important one to the investigation of the assassination, particularly because he'd been in touch with the diplomatic offices of two sworn enemies of the United States. So, was he acting at the behest of the communists? What was going on? This was an important thing, which the Warren Commission sort of investigated, but not really. They didn't really look at it too carefully. They didn't want to, and the CIA didn't want them to. And so Scott points out in his memoir that the Warren Commission said something about Oswald and the surveillance of Oswald that wasn't true. And what the Warren Commission said was the CIA didn't know that Oswald had made contact with the Cubans until after the assassination. The cover story, was that we didn't know that he was in touch with the Cubans until we reviewed our records after the assassination, and then we realized, oh yeah, he was in touch with the Cubans. That was nonsense. And Winston Scott said it was nonsense. And it was nonsense because his surveillance networks were so effective and comprehensive. No American made contact with those embassies without his knowledge. And in fact, as the paper trail subsequently showed, Winston Scott was notified within a couple of days about Oswald's presence in Mexico City in early October 1963, while President Kennedy was still alive. So this assertion of fact, and it was a fact, because who would know better, in Scott's memoir was a big, big problem, because it suggested that the CIA either deceived the Warren Commission or the Warren Commission was mistaken. And it was somebody from inside the CIA who was saying it. That was one thing. But then the second thing that was in the chapter on Oswald was Scott offered his personal point of view that there had been a conspiracy. And this was also a huge problem for the CIA. If a top CIA official came out in 1971 and said the Warren Commission was wrong, that would have been a major, major news story and a major, major problem for the CIA. Scott had a heart attack and died. Some people say that death was suspicious, and we can get to that in a minute. But in any case, the CIA, Jim Angleton, flew to Mexico City, scooped up the manuscript and the contents of Scott's office, which probably included audio tapes of Oswald, and brought it all back to CIA headquarters, and the story was buried for about 30 years. So that chapter where he talks about Oswald was a kind of time bomb that was defused by the CIA. If that had come out in 1971, people were talking about reopening the Kennedy assassination investigation. That might have done it. And it did happen a few years later. But by suppressing Scott's manuscript, the CIA saved itself a world of trouble.
Right. I mean, this is a guy who was right there at the beginning, at the inception, OSS.
Yeah, right.
Wild Bill Donovan. So, I mean, he had that credibility, and he died young, 62, fairly young.
Yeah. Now, when I wrote this book, there were stories that people said his death was suspicious. And I took those seriously because one of the people who said that was Thomas Mann. And Thomas Mann was the U.S. ambassador to Mexico in the Kennedy administration. So from 60 to 63, Tom Mann knew Winston Scott very well. And when Winston Scott died, Tom Mann told somebody, he said, oh, they finally got to Win, like they killed him. And one other source said that kind of the same thing. I had no corroboration of that, and I had no reason to doubt that, so I didn't include it in the book. Understanding the milieu that he operated in now, I mean, I'm not saying that his death was foul play, but it could have been. I think, it was unexplained. He didn't want to talk about it. he came home one night badly bruised, and he said that he was in the back of the house, kind of in suburban Mexico City, kind of a suburban area with separate detached houses, big yards, and he was on top of a wall. They were building a wall around the property, and he fell off of it. You know, some people doubted that story, and they thought he might have been beat up. In any case, he had a heart attack a few days later and died, right sitting at his breakfast table. So I don't know that I would call the death suspicious, but knowing more about that milieu, I wonder more about it. And
He
but
he
yeah,
was surrounded in the company of a lot of people who get put into, the events of November 22nd, 63. Adley Phillips, Hunt, supposedly his son says, that looks like my dad is the tramp.
yeah,
St. John Hunt. So there, I mean, and
yeah,
you even mentioned in the book, it's very cutthroat inside that environment. I think that's
yeah,
awesome.
yeah. No, and I think that's the reality of that world. And if you think of the stakes of how explosive that memoir was, I mentioned before Jim Angleton, the chief of counterintelligence, his longtime friend, flew down to Mexico City and seized the manuscript and all the contents of his home office. 3 suitcases and 4, boxes of material were removed, according to the CIA cables on the subject.
And
Among
that's
that,
not, sorry to interrupt, but I don't think that's the first time Angleton, I think you mentioned in your book, well, didn't he go after Mary Myers' diary or something like that? Or there's some
yes. This was a familiar type of errand for Angleton.
Yeah.
In 1964, when Mary Meyer, the ex-wife of Cordmeyer, senior CIA official, and lover of President Kennedy for a couple of years, when she was murdered in Washington in 1964, Angleton went and seized her. It wasn't really a diary; it was more like a sketch pad. She was an artist, and so it was a kind of sketch pad and diary. And Angleton went looking for that and came away with it, and it never surfaced. People were interested in that because she'd had this affair with President Kennedy, and so obviously the contents of that diary might have been explosive as well. So so this kind of control of inside information is part of life at the top of the CIA. That was, they needed to do damage control, and that was one way they did it. So
right, so it's not just getting information from the outside; it's maintaining information control on the inside. So a lot of that's taking place. Iggy and all these other characters, Marchetti.
yeah.
We're at 37 minutes. So then the third part of this trilogy is going to come out later on in 2022. Can you go talk a little bit about your next project, which is Scorpion's Dance?
Scorpion's Dance is the third book in the trilogy of spies. Our Man in Mexico, about Winston Scott. The Ghost, about Jim Angleton. And Scorpion's Dance is about Richard Helms, the director of the CIA in much of this period, in the 1960s and 1970s. Dick Helms met Winston Scott and Jim Angleton as young men in the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. They all 3 went into the CIA upon its founding in 1947. Scott becomes a station chief, Angleton becomes the counterintelligence chief, and Helms becomes the director. And so in Scorpion's Dance, which will be published by St. Martin's Press in June, I tell the story of Richard Helms and Richard Nixon and how their kind of labyrinthine, complex, Machiavellian relationship evolves over the years and eventually leads to the Watergate scandal. And I think that's the important part about the third book, about Scorpion's Dance, is I think the key to understanding the Watergate scandal, how it came to pass that these burglars were working for the White House, you have to understand the relationship of Richard Nixon and Richard Helms, which was not really understood at the time. This was not the story that Woodward and Bernstein and the Washington Post uncovered. They really focused on what the president and his men were doing with the burglars, but how the burglars came to be and how they came to be working for the White House, my book really explains that in a way that hasn't been explained before. That Richard Helms, they weren't exactly working for Richard Helms when they went to work for the White House, but they were vouched for by him. Helms
Right,
kind
it's the
of
same
provided.
character we talked about, Hunt, right? So
Yeah. So and another part of the story, one of the revelations of the book is just how close Richard Helms and Howard Hunt were. It was known at the time that they were friends, but Helms was very good at kind of playing off. I sort of saying I barely knew the man.
right.
And that was nonsense. They were buddies, but Helms very skillfully kind of kept that out of the public record. And I tell that story, which is so amusing and poignant and ultimately sad. When you get to the end of the book, you'll see there's a surprise ending between those two men that's definitely interesting.
Look forward to reading it and
Yeah.
talking with you about it. Hopefully, when it comes out in June
Yes.
2022. Full title is Scorpion's Dance: The President, the Spy Master, and Watergate. So sounds really interesting. Again, the book we talked about today is Our Man in Mexico, Winston Scott, and the Hidden History of the CIA. Is there anything you'd like to add, Jefferson? Anything I missed before we wrap up? Anything else you'd like to promote other than your book?
No, just if people are interested in the JFK story, JFK Facts is a blog that keeps up with new developments in the JFK story. But I think that, if you're interested in the history of the CIA, the history of the Cold War, the underside of American politics in the 1960s and 1970s, these three books really provide a unique glimpse into how things were really working.
Yeah, agreed. Definitely a different angle than what is commonly talked about in history. You see it from the inside and these guys' machinations and stuff.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for your time. Jefferson Morley, appreciate it.
Thank you, William.
All right, stay there.